Hey everybody, this is the 5th video of part 2 of Negative Dialectics by Theodor Adorno. The first section is titled Passage to Materialism. I should say this is also the final video. So, let's rock. Passage to Materialism. It is by passing to the object's preponderance that dialectics is rendered materialistic. The object, the positive expression of non-identity, is a terminological mask. Once the object becomes an object of cognition, its physical side is spiritualized from the outset by translation into epistemology, by a reduction of the sort which in the end, in general, was methodologically prescribed by the phenomenology of Husserl. When the categories of subject and object, both insoluble in the critique of knowledge, come to appear false, as not purely opposed to each other, this also means that the object's objective side, the part of it which cannot be spiritualized, is called, quote, object, only from the viewpoint of a subjectively aimed analysis in which the subject's primacy seems beyond question. Viewed from outside, that which in reflecting upon the mind appears specifically as not mental, as an object, is material. The category of non-identity still obeys the measure of identity. Emancipated from that measure, the non-identical moments show up as matter, or as inseparably fused with material things. Sensation, the crux of all epistemology, needs epistemology to reinterpret it into a fact of consciousness, in contradiction to its own full character, which after all is to serve as authority for its cognition. There is no sensation without a somatic moment. To this extent, the concept of sensation, in comparison with that which it allegedly subsumes, is twisted so as to satisfy the demand for an autarkic connection of all cognitive steps. While sensation is part of a consciousness, while sensation is a part of consciousness, according to the cognitive principle of styling, its phenomenology, unbiased, under the rules of cognition, would have to describe it equally as that which consciousness does not exhaust. Every sensation is a physical feeling also. The feeling does not even, quote, accompany, end quote, it, for that would presuppose a tangibility of the sensation's churismos. In fact, it gets this churismos solely from the neological intent, from abstraction, strictly speaking. The linguistic shading of such words as, quote, sensuous, quote, sensual, even, quote, sensation itself, shows how little the designated facts are the pure moments of cognition as which they are treated in epistemology. To the subjectively immanent reconstruction of the world of things, sensation is the basis of its hierarchy, but it would not have that basis without the physis, which an autarkic epistemology wants to build later on top of it. The somatic moment as the not purely cognitive part of cognition is irreducible, and thus the subjective claim collapses at the very point where radical empiricism had conserved it. The fact that the subject's cognitive achievements are somatic, in accordance with their own meaning, affects not only the basic relation of subject and object, but the dignity of physicality. Physicality emerges as the ontical pole of subjective cognition, as the core of that cognition. This dethrones the guiding idea of epistemology to constitute the body as the law governing the link between sensations and acts. In other words, to constitute it mentally. Sensations are already in themselves what the system would like to set forth as their formation by consciousness. By tailoring its categories, traditional philosophy has bewitched what is heterogeneous to it. Neither the subject nor the object are merely, quote, posited, in Hegel's manner of speaking. This alone explains fully why the antagonism which philosophy clothed in the words, quote, subject and, quote, object cannot be interpreted as a primal state of facts. If it could be so interpreted, the mind would be turned into the body's downright otherness, contradicting its immanent somatic side. But to have the mind alone void the antagonism is impossible, because that in turn would virtually spiritualize it. Showing equally in the antagonism are two things: that which seeks precedence over and withdraws from the subject, and the fact that our time is unreconciled with the subject, the obverse form, as it were, of the precedence of objectivity. New section: Materialism and Immediacy. Where the idealist critique of materialism proceeds imminently, where it does not simply preach, it likes to make use of the doctrine of immediate data. Like all judgments about the world of things, the concept of matter is to be based upon facts of consciousness. If things of the mind were equated with the cerebral processes, according to popular materialist usage, our original sense perception would, so says the idealistic counter-argument, have to be perceptions of what goes on in the brain, not perceptions of color, for instance. Such refutations are indisputably stringent because the straw men they are knocking down are arbitrary. The reduction to processes of consciousness clings to the apron strings of the scientific, cognitive ideal of the need to confirm the validity of scientific propositions methodically and without a gap. Verification, itself subject to philosophical problematics, comes to be the guideline of that problematics. Science is ontologized, so to speak, as if the criteria of the validity of judgments, the course pursued in their testing, were simply the same as the states of fact, whereas in truth judgments are retroactive treatments of already constituted facts, under the norms of their subjective intelligibility. In testing scientific judgments, we mostly have to make clear to ourselves, step by step, how we arrive at each judgment. The test is thus subjectively accentuated. What mistakes were made by the knowing subject when the judgment was made, one that conflicts with other propositions in the same field, for instance. But it is evident that such retroactive questioning does not coincide with the judged fact itself and its objective causes. If a man has miscalculated and his mistake is pointed out to him, this does not mean that either his arithmetic problem or the applicable mathematical rules can be reduced to, quote, his calculation, however indispensable subjective acts may be to that calculation as moments of its objectivity. The consequences of this distinction for the concept of a transcendental, constitutive logic are considerable. Kant repeated the mistake with which Kant charged his rationalistic predecessors, an amphibole of the concepts of reflection. In place of the objective reasons for the judgment, he put a reflection on the cognitive subject's course in judging. Here again the critique of pure reason was revealed as a theory of science. To install that amphibole as a philosophical principle, and to end up pressing metaphysical wine out of it, may have been the most fatal Freudian slip in the history of modern philosophy. And yet, from the viewpoint of a philosophy of history, it is comprehensible. The Thomist Ordo had presented objectivity as God's will. The destruction of that order seemed to result in a breakdown of objectivity. At the same time, however, scientific objectivity, as opposed to mere opinion, increased immensely, and with it the self-confidence of its organ, the ratio. The contradiction was soluble by letting the ratio induce one to reinterpret it from an instrument, an appeals court for reflection, into a constituent by proceeding ontologically in the way in which the rationalist school of Wolff proceeded explicitly. In that sense, Kantian criticism too remained enmeshed in pre-critical thinking, as did the whole doctrine of subjective constitution. The post-Kantian idealists made this manifest. Theoretically, the hypostasis of the medium, by now a matter of course in human custom, lay in the so-called, quote, Copernican turn, unquote. Kant took care to introduce this as a metaphor whose substantial tendency is the very opposite of the astronomical term. The traditional discursive logic that conducts the current argument against materialism would require criticizing the procedure as a petio principii, the precedence of consciousness, which is to legitimize science, as presupposed at the start of the critique of pure reason, is then inferred from procedural standards that confirm or refute judgments in line with scientific rules. Such a logical circle invalidates the wrong approach. It hushes up that in themselves, as doubtlessly and absolutely primary, pure facts of consciousness at large do not exist. This was the basic experience of the fin de siècle. How do you pronounce that word?
Fin de siècle.
Shit.
Fin de siècle. Fin de siècle.
Fin du siècle? The siècle? I don't fucking know. Fin du siècle of the neo-romanticist generation, with its nervous horror of the reigning notion of the psyche as a flat factuality. Ex post facto, in response to the dictates of validity control and a need for classification, facts of consciousness will be distinguished from their transitions to physical innervations, in particular, subtle borderline transitions that refute the supposed solidity of those facts. It is in keeping with this that no subjective immediate data, no quote I, to which they might be given, is possible independently of the trans-subjective world. He to whom something is given belongs a priori to the same sphere of the given thing. This confounds the thesis of subjective a priority. Materialism is not the dogma indicted by clever opponents, but a dissolution of things understood as dogmatic. Hence it is right to a place in critical philosophy. When Kant in Grundlegung der Metaphysik der Sitten construed freedom as freedom from sensation, he was paying involuntary homage to the very thing he wished to argue away. We can no more save the absolute segregation of body and mind, which is tantamount to a secret supremacy of the mind, than we can save the idealistic hierarchy of data. Historically, in the evolutionary course of rationality and ego principle, the two have come into opposition to each other, yet neither is without the other. The logic of non-contradictoriness may fault this, but that logic is brought to a halt by the state of facts. The phenomenology, all facts of consciousness, requires a transcending of their definitions. New section. Dialectics, not a sociology of knowledge. It was Marx who drew the line between historic materialism and the popular metaphysical kind. He thus involved the former in the problematics of philosophy, leaving popular materialism to cut its dogmatic capers this side of philosophy. Since then, materialism is no longer a counterposition one may resolve to take. It is the critique of idealism in its entirety and of the reality for which idealism opts by distorting it. Horkheimer's phrasing, quote, critical theory, seeks not to make materialism acceptable, but to use it to make men theoretically conscious of what it is that distinguishes materialism from amateurish explications of the world as much as from the, quote, traditional theory, end quote, of science. A dialectical theory is bound, like Marx's, largely to be immanent, even if, in the end, it negates the whole sphere it moves in. This contrasts it with a sociology of knowledge that has been merely brought up from outside and is powerless against philosophy, as philosophy was quick to discover. A sociology of knowledge fails before philosophy. For the truth content of philosophy is substitutes its social function and its conditioning by interests, while refraining from a critique of that content itself, remaining indifferent toward it. It fails equally before the concept of ideology, which will stir into its broader beggarly broth. For the concept of ideology makes sense only in relation to the truth or untruth of what it refers to. There can be no talk of socially necessary delusions except in regard to what would not be a delusion, although, of course, delusion is its index. The task of criticizing ideology is to judge the subjective and objective shares and their dynamics. It is to deny the false objectivity of concept fetishism by reducing it to the social subject, and to deny false subjectivity, the sometimes unrecognizably veiled claim that all being lies in the mind, by showing it up as a fraud, a parasitical non-entity, as well as demonstrating its imminent hostility to the mind. The, quote, all of the indiscriminately total concept of ideology, however, terminates in nothingness. Once it had ceased to differ from any true consciousness, it is no longer fit to criticize a false one. In the idea of objective truth, materialist dialectics necessarily turns philosophy, despite and because of all its criticisms of philosophy. Let me repeat that last sentence. In the idea of objective truth, materialist dialectics necessarily turns philosophical, despite and because of all its criticisms of philosophy. A sociology of knowledge, on the other hand, denies not only the objective structure of society, but the idea of objective truth and its cognition. To this sociology, as to the type of positivist economics to which its founder, Pareto, belonged, society is nothing but the average value of individual reactive modes. The doctrine of ideology turns back into a doctrine of subjective idols, similar to the early bourgeois one. In fact, this is a shyster's trick to get rid of materialist dialectics as a whole, along with philosophy. Classification serves the tel quel localization of the mind. Such a reduction of so-called, quote, forms of consciousness, end quote, goes perfectly with philosophical apologetics. The excuse of the sociology of knowledge, that the truth or untruth of philosophical teaching has nothing to do with social conditions, remains undisturbed. Relativism allies itself with the division of labor. The late Scheler did not hesitate to exploit this in his, quote, two worlds theory. The only way to pass philosophically into social categories is to decipher the truth content of philosophical categories. New section, the concept of mind. We know that Hegel, in Hegel's chapter on master and servant, develops the genesis of self-consciousness from the labor relation, and that he does this by adjusting the I to its self-determined purpose, as well as to heterogeneous matter. The origin of, quote, I, in, quote, not I, remains scarcely veiled. It is looked up in the real living process, in the legalities of the survival of the species, of providing it with nutriments. Thereafter, Hegel hypothesizes the mind, but in vain. To succeed somehow, he must blow it up into a whole, the total spirit. Although according to the concept of the mind, its differentia specifica is that it is a subject and thus not the whole. Such subreption yields to no straining of the dialectical concept. A mind that is to be a totality is nonsense. It resembles the political parties in the singular, which made their appearance in the 20th century, tolerating no other party besides them, the parties whose aims grin in totalitarian states as allegories of the direct power of the particular. If we conceive the mind as a totality, eliminating every difference from the otherness it is to live by, according to Hegel, the mind turns for a second time into the nothingness which at the outset of dialectical logic is to reveal pure being. The total spirit would evaporate in mere entity. At the time he wrote Phenomenology of Mind, Hegel would hardly have hesitated to designate the concept of the mind as self-transmitted, as both mind and not mind. He would not have followed up by casting off the chains of absolute identity. Yet if the mind, in what it is, needs that which it is not, a recourse to labor is no longer what apologists for this philosophical field reiterate as their last wisdom. It is no longer a some word in Greek. There remains the idealist insight that mental activity, as labor, is carried on as much by individuals as by the means they employ, and the performance of this activity denigrates the individuals to its function. The idealist concept of the spirit exploits the passage to social labor. It is easy for the general activity that absorbs the individual actors to be transfigured into a noumenon while the individuals are ignored. The polemical answer to this is materialist sympathy with nominalism. Philosophically, however, the answer was too narrow. The thesis that individuality and individuals alone are the true reality was incompatible with Marx's Hegelian trained theory of the law of value, which capitalism realizes over the heads of men. The dialectical transmission of the universal and the particular does not permit a theory that opts for the particular to overzealously treat the universal as a soap bubble. Such treatment would let the theory grasp neither the universal's pernicious supremacy in the status quo, nor the idea of conditions which, in giving individuals their due, would rid the universal of its wretched particularity. But even to imagine a transcendental subject without society, without the individuals whom it integrates for good or ill, is just as impossible. That is what the concept of the transcendental subject founders on. Even Kant's universality seeks to be one for all, that is to say, for all rational beings, and the rational are a priori socialized. Scheller's attempt to banish materialism unceremoniously to the nominalist side was a tactical maneuver. First, and not without help from an undeniable lack of philosophical reflection, materialism was blackened as subaltern, and then its subalternity was gloriously conquered. The loathing which materialist dialectics felt for any crude Weltanschauung made it prefer an alliance with science, and yet, in its decline to a means of political rule, dialectics itself turned into such a Weltanschauung. Its conflicts with Brecht's suicidal demand for simplification to tactical ends. It remains dialectical in nature, philosophy and anti-philosophy at once. The line that consciousness depends on being was not a metaphysics in reverse. It was pointed at the delusion that the mind is in itself, and it lies beyond the total process in which it finds itself as a moment. Yet the conditions of the mind are not a noumenon either. The term, quote, being means altogether different things to Marx and to Heidegger, and yet there is a common trait in the ontological doctrine of being's priority over thought. in the, quote, transcendence of being. The materialist echo reverberates from a vast distance. The doctrine of being turns ideological as it imperceptibly spiritualizes the materialist moment in thought by transposing it into pure functionality beyond all entity, as it removes by magic whatever critique of a false consciousness resides in the materialist concept of being. The word that was to name truth against ideology comes to be the most untrue. The denial of ideality becomes the proclamation of an ideal sphere. New section, pure activity and genesis. It is the mind's definition as an activity which imminently compels philosophy to pass from the mind to the mind's otherness. From Kant on, no idealism could escape this definition, not even Hegel's. Activity, however, involves the mind and the genesis which irks idealism as a contaminant. As the philosophers keep repeating, the mind as an activity is a sort of becoming, and therefore almost more important to them yet, it is some word in Greek of history. The simple concept of mental activity makes it intratemporal and historic, because as well as that which has become, and in which becoming has accumulated. As the most general notion of time takes something temporal, no activity is without a substrate, without an agent and that which is acted upon. The idea of absolute activity hides only what is to be active. The pure, some word in Greek, is the shamefaced, metaphysically neutralized belief in a divine creator. The idealist doctrine of the absolute would absorb theological transcendence as a process, would bring it to an immanence that tolerates no absoluteness, no independence of ontical conditions. It may be idealism's most profound incongruity that on the one hand it must carry secularization to extremes lest it sacrifice its claim to totality, while on the other hand it cannot express totality, its phantom of the absolute, except in the theological categories. Torn out of religion, these categories come to be non-entities and are not fulfilled in that, quote, experience of consciousness, unquote, and to whose charge they are now given. Once humanized, mental activity can be attributed to no one and to nothing but the living. Thus a natural element infiltrates even the concept, which most highly overshoots all naturalism, the concept of subjectivity as the synthetic unity of apperception. Only if the I, on its part, is also not I, does it react to the not I. Only then does it, quote, do something. Only then would the doing itself be thinking. Thinking in a second reflection breaks the supremacy of thinking over its otherness, because it always is otherness already, within itself. Hence the supreme abstraction of all activity, the transcendental function, does not deserve to be ranked above the factual genesis. No ontological abyss yawns between the moment of reality in that function and the activity of real subjects, and neither, therefore, does one yawn between the mind and labor. It is true that labor, the production of something that was a conception but not yet a fact, is not exhausted in existence. The mind can no more be leveled down to existence than existence can be leveled down to the mind. But the mind's non-being moment is so intertwined with existence that to pick it out neatly would be the same as to objectify and falsify it. The controversy about the priority of mind and body is a pre-dialectical proceeding. It carries on the question of a, quote, first, all but hylozoistically aimed at a, some word in Greek, in its ontological in form to me. all hylozoistically aimed at some word in Greek. It is ontological in form, although the answer may sound materialistic in substance. Both body and mind are abstractions of their experience. Their radical difference is posited, reflecting the mind's historically gained, quote, self-consciousness and its rejection of what it denies for its own identity's sake. All mental things are modified physical impulses, and such modification is their qualitative recoil into what not merely, quote, is. Urge, according to Schelling's insight, is the mind's preliminary form. Footnote, quote, being too is thus completely indifferent toward entity. But the closer, the more inherently pleasurable this relaxed state, the more inevitable it is that the inactive, unwitting creation in eternity of a quiet craving to come to oneself, a craving to find and to enjoy oneself, an urge to grow conscious of which, nonetheless, the relaxation does not make one conscious, end quote. Schelling in Die Weltalter. And, quote, and this from the bottom stage on, we see nature follow its inmost, most hidden desire to keep rising and advancing in its urge, until at last it has attracted the highest essentiality, the pure spirituality itself, and has made it its own, end quote. Schelling. End footnote. New section. Suffering physical. The supposed basic facts of consciousness are something other than mere facts of consciousness. In the dimension of pleasure and displeasure, they are invaded by a physical moment. All pain and all negativity, the moving forces of dialectical thinking, assume the various conveyed, sometimes unrecognizable form of physical things, just as all happiness aims at sensual fulfillment and obtains its objectivity in that fulfillment. A happiness blocked off from every such aspect is no happiness. This dimension is the anti-spiritual side of the spirit, and in subjective sense, data, it is enfeebled, so to speak, into the spirit's epistemological copy, not so very different from Hume's curious theory that our ideas, facts, God damn it, where did that? Not so very different from Hume's curious theories that Hume's curious theory that our ideas, facts of consciousness, with an intentional function, are faded copies of our impressions. This doctrine is easily criticized as secretly expressing a naive naturalism. In fact, it is a last epistemological quiver of the somatic element, before that element is totally expelled. It is the somatic element's survival. In knowledge, as the unrest that makes knowledge move, the unassuaged or unrest that reproduces itself in the advancement of knowledge. Conscious unhappiness is not a delusion of the mind's vanity, but something inherent in the mind, the one authentic dignity it has received in its separation from the body. This dignity is the mind's negative reminder of its physical aspect. Its capability of that aspect is the only source of whatever hope the mind can have. The smallest trace of senseless suffering in the empirical world belies all the identitarian philosophy that would talk us out of that suffering. Quote, while there is a beggar, there is a myth, end quote, as Benjamin put it. This is why the philosophy of identity is the mythological form of thought. The physical moment tells our knowledge that the suffering ought not to be, that things should be different. Quote, woe speaks, go. End quote. Hence the convergence of specific materialism with criticism, with social change in practice. It is not up to the individual sufferer to abolish suffering or mitigate it to a degree which theory cannot anticipate, to which it can set no limit. This job is up solely to the species, to which the individual belongs, even where he subjectively renounces it, and is objectively thrust into the absolute loneliness of a helpless object. All activities of the species point to its continued physical existence, although they may be misconceptions of it. Independent organizations whose business is done only by the way. Even the steps which society takes to exterminate itself are at the same time absurd acts of unleashed self-preservation. They are forms of unconscious social action against suffering, even though an obtuse view of society's own interest turns their total particularity against that interest. Confronted with such steps, their purpose, and this alone makes society a society, calls for it to be so organized as the productive forces would directly permit it here and now, and as the conditions of production on either side relentlessly prevent it. The telos of such an organization of society would be to negate the physical suffering of even the least of its members, and to negate the internal reflexive forms of that suffering. By now, this negation in the interest of all can be realized only in a solidarity that is transparent to itself and all the living. New section. Materialism imageless. To those who do not want such realization, materialism has since done the favor to debase itself. The tutelage that caused this is not mankind's own fault, as Kant thought. In the meantime, at least, it has come to be systematically reproduced by men in power. The objective spirit, which they maneuver because they need its restraint, adjusts to a consciousness that has been restrained over thousands of years. A materialism come to political power is no less sold on such practices than the world it once wanted to change. It keeps fettering the human consciousness instead of comprehending it and changing it on its part. On the threadbare pretext of a dictatorship, now half a century old, of the proletariat, long bureaucratically administered, governmental terror machines entrench themselves as permanent institutions, mocking the theory they carry on their lips. They chain their vassals to their most direct concerns and keep them stupid. Yet the deprivation of theory could not have happened had there been no apocryphal dregs in it. In their summary treatment of culture, from the outside, the functionaries who monopolize it would clumsily feign superiority to culture, thereby rendering aid to universal regression. Those whose expectations of imminent revolution made them wish to liquidate philosophy were impatient enough with its demands to lag behind philosophy even then. The apocryphal part of materialism reveals the one of high philosophy. The untruth in the sovereignty of the spirit, which the reigning materialism disdains, as cynically as bourgeois society used to in secret. Idealistic majesty is the apocryphal imprint, a relationship which the text of Kafka and Beckett glaringly illuminate. The deficiencies of materialism are the unreflected deficiencies of the prevailing condition. What has been unable to keep up due to the failing principle of spiritualization is worse in comparison with that which is superior and shamed by the sight of the lasting inferior. This extraterritoriality of the fourth estate is perpetuated by materialism's Philistine and barbarian aspects, perpetuated into a culture which is now no longer confined to the fourth estate, but has spread throughout culture itself. Materialism comes to be the very relapse into barbarism which it was supposed to prevent. To work against this is not the most irrelevant among the tasks of critical theory. Otherwise, the old untruth will continue with the diminished coefficient of friction and a more baneful effect. Subalternity increases once the revolution has suffered the same fate as the Second Coming. Materialist theory became not only aesthetically defective, as against the vacuous sublimity of bourgeois consciousness, it became untrue. This is theoretically determinable. Dialectics lies in things, but it could not exist without the consciousness that reflects it, no more than it can evaporate into that consciousness. If matter were total, undifferentiated, and flatly singular, there would be no dialectics in it. In official materialist dialectics, epistemology was skipped by fiat. Epistemology's revenge has been the image doctrine. The thought is not an image of the thing. It becomes that only in an Epicurean-style materialist mythology, which invents the emission by matters of little images. The thought aims at the thing itself. Demythologization, the thought's enlightenment intent, deletes the image character of consciousness. What clings to the image remains idolatry, mythic enthrallment. The totality of images blends into a wall before reality. The image theory denies the spontaneity of the subject, a movens, of the objective dialectics of productive forces and conditions. If the subject is bound to mulishly mirror the object, necessarily missing the object, which only opens itself to the subjective surplus in the thought, the result is the unpeaceful spiritual silence of integral administration. Nothing but an indefatigably reified consciousness will believe, or will persuade others to believe, that it possesses photographs of objectivity. The illusions of such a consciousness turn into dogmatic immediacies. When Lenin, rather than go in for epistemology, opposed it and compulsively reiterated avowals of the noumenality of cognitive objects, Lenin meant to demonstrate that subjective positivism is conspiring with the powers that be. Lenin's political requirements turned Lenin against the goal of theoretical cognition. A transcendent argumentation disposes of things on the basis of its claim to power, and with disastrous results. The unpenetrated target of the criticism remains undisturbed as it is, and not being hit at all, it can be resurrected at will, in changed constellations of power. Brecht said once that the book on imperial criticism obviated any further need to criticize the philosophy of immanence. It was a short-sighted remark. Materialist theory is subject to philosophical desiderata if it is not to succumb to the same provincialism that disfigures art in Eastern countries. The object of theory is not something immediate, of which theory might carry home a replica. Knowledge has not, like the state police, a rogues gallery of its objects. Rather, it conceives them as it conveys them, else it would be content to describe the facade. As Brecht did admit, after all, the criterion of sense perception, overstretched and problematic even in the proper place, is not applicable to radically indirect society. What immigrated into the object as the law of its motion, inevitably concealed by the ideological form of the phenomenon, excludes that criterion. Marx, disgusted with the academic squabbles, went rampaging through the epistemological categories like the proverbial bull in the china shop. Marx scarcely put too much weight on terms such as, quote, reflection, where alleged supremacy is won at the cost of the subjective critical moment. Living side by side with ideology in the stress on that moment is a bit of hostility to ideology, a bar to the subreption that products and conditions of production are immediate nature. No theory may, for agitatorial simplicity's sake, play the fool about objectively attained knowledge. Theory must reflect the state of this knowledge and permit its advance. The unity of theory and practice was not meant as a concession to weakness of thought, which is a turretism spawned by the repressive society. The computer, which thinking wants to make its own equal, and to whose greater glory it would, like nothing better than to eliminate itself, is the bankruptcy petition of consciousness in the face of a reality which at the present stage is not given visually but functionally, an abstraction in itself. Representational thinking would be without reflection an undialectical contradiction, for without reflection there is no theory. A consciousness interpolating images, a third element, between itself and that which it thinks, would unwittingly reproduce idealism. A body of ideas would substitute for the object of cognition, and the subjective arbitrariness of such ideas is that of the authorities. The materialist longing to grasp the thing aims at the opposite. It is only in the absence of images that the full object could be conceived. Such absence occurs with the theological ban on images. Materialism brought that ban into secular form by not permitting utopia to be positively pictured. This is the substance of its negativity. At its most materialistic, materialism comes to agree with theology. Its great desire would be the resurrection of the flesh, a desire utterly foreign to idealism, the realm of the absolute spirit. The prospective vanishing point of historic materialism would be its self-sublimation, the spirit's liberation from the primacy of material needs in their state of fulfillment. Only if the physical urge were quenched, would the spirit be reconciled and would become that which it only promises, while the spell of material conditions will not let it satisfy material needs. And that is the end, everybody, of part two of Negative Dialectics by Adorno. This is the 5th video of that section. The next section, part 3, is titled, the next part of the book titled part 3, the next part of the book, part 3, is titled Models. Jesus Christ. Thanks for listening.